Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our closing plenary of the Research Facility on Inequality. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute privilege to serve you once again as the moderator of this all-important conversation. Now, before we get started today, I think it would be important for us just to pause and take a quick recap of the big conversations that we've been having over the last 4 days. A couple of the themes that have surfaced include the fact that we really need to look at inequalities in Africa with the lens of prioritizing them. And this is not only because we know that demographic growth is going to be coming from this continent in the future, but also because today, 7 out of the 10 most unequal countries are found on the continent of Africa. There was a massive conversation around climate change and understanding this and engaging climate change within the context of existing inequalities, and of course, bringing into the frame other drivers like pollution, like conflicts, really that are exacerbating the impact of climate change as a driver of inequality. There was a lot of conversation over the last 4 days about the capacity of local stakeholders. And in addition to this, really thinking about how do we drive ownership of the measures of inequality at the local stakeholder level. And if we truly want to see policies that are inclusive and processes that are inclusive, we've got to be more deliberate about engaging our local stakeholders. Now, tools and metrics, tools and measures certainly receive their fair share of the conversation, especially if we want to be serious about the reduction of inequality. There was a lot of conversation, ladies and gentlemen, about analyzing the determinants of inequality and doing this more courageously in the sense of moving beyond colonial origins to really look at other variables like social capital, to look at growth paths as a way of really getting a comprehensive understanding on how we might reduce inequalities. Now, last but certainly not least was a conversation around spatial inequality and the extent to which these have the ability to translate into unequal opportunity, and that although we know we do have geographical targeted interventions, we need to do this within existing state apparatus and be innovative about how we address some of these spatial inequalities. All of these conversations are just a snippet of the last 4 days, but what they have done is that they've culminated to this point where we are now looking at our closing session and our closing plenary. What you're going to experience today is that we're going to start off with 2 keynote addresses. We have a keynote address from Professor Thomas Piketty, and we also have a keynote address from Minister Arturo Herrera Gutierrez, who is, of course, the Minister of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico. They're going to put forward their presentations, but we're also going to pause. We're going to give them an opportunity to react to each other's presentations. And as always, I've kept my promise of integrating your voice into this conversation. We're going to see if we can't bring in a question or two from you to engage with Professor Thomas Piketty and, of course, with Minister Gutierrez. After that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to broaden the conversation just a little bit into a high-level panel discussion where we're really going to be looking at the political economy of inequality reduction. Remember that in these conversations, we're not just looking at policies that have worked and policies that haven't worked. We're also interested in the barriers that keep the implementation of these policies not at their optimum. As I get started, allow me to also just remind you of the following. We are live tweeting. Our hashtag remains the same. It's hashtag Research Inequalities. So do join the global conversation on social media. I still want to hear your voices. So we are still using Slido as a way of integrating your questions. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. All you need to do is send me your questions and I'll try and integrate them into today's proceedings. And that is it. And that really gets us ready now to start off with our conversation. You will also notice, of course, that we do have French and English interpretation to make sure that this conversation is as inclusive as possible. So I think I've done enough speaking. I know that you want to hear from Professor Thomas Piketty more than you want to hear from me. So allow me to introduce a man who hardly needs introduction. He's a world-renowned economist and professor of economics at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Science at the Paris School of Economics. He is the co-director of the World Inequality Labs and the World Inequality Database, and one of the initiators of the Manifesto for Democratization in Europe. I'm going to end it off by, of course, mentioning that he is the author of international bestsellers, Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology. Professor Thomas Piketty, it's an absolute privilege and a pleasure. The floor is yours. And if you could unmute for me, sir. Thank you
yes,
so much.
yes, thank you, Nozi. Thank you to the organizers. So let me try to share my screen. My English is going to sound a lot like French, so I hope this will be inclusive enough for everybody and that you can understand what I have to say. Okay, so this presentation, I think you can see my screen now. So this presentation, I have given a title, A Brief History of Equality, which is more than what I will be able to deliver in this brief talk. Basically, I will draw a few lessons from my latest book, Capital and Ideology, and from the World Inequality Database. So let me start by saying a few words about my last book, Capital and Ideology, this is again a book about the history of inequality over time and across countries, like Capital in the 21st Century. But I think this is a better book. I think I'm moving slowly in the right direction. I'm making progress. I mean, this is still a book with a lot of limitation, and I apologize, for all the limitations. I'm trying to learn from the kind of discussion and that we have today. I think this is moving in the right direction, in particular because it is less Western-centered than the previous book. It covers more the rest of the world. We've made a lot of effort, and I'm going to show you some data to cover, Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and to offer a broader global perspective on the history of inequality. But this is still very much insufficient. And also, this new book puts the emphasis on politics and ideology as a key driver of the transformation of inequality regime in the long run. And in that sense, this is a relatively optimistic book, in the sense that I strongly believe that politics and social mobilization can bring new institutions which can change in a very important way, and sometimes much faster than we tend to imagine the structure of inequality in societies. So let me start right away with, I'm going to show you a couple of maps coming from the World Inequality Database. So you can go to the website, World Inequality Database, wid.world, to get more of this data. But let me start with this map. So what you have on this map is the top 10% income share across the world. So this is, I'm going to show you the bottom 50% income share in 1 minute, but let me start with the top 10% income share. So by definition, if we had complete equality in a country, the top 10% income share should be 10%, because this is 10% of the population. If we had complete inequality, they should get 100%. So of course, it's always between 10 and 100%. Now, what's interesting is that it actually varies quite a lot. So on this map, you can see that it goes basically from 20-25 to up to almost 70%. So, it doesn't go from 10 to 100, but it goes from 20 to 70, basically. So these are huge variations. So, the most equal countries in the world, which would be Sweden or Norway, would have 20-25%. Or they used to be closer to 20-25. Now they are a bit higher than 25, between 25 and 30. I mean, it has changed a little bit in recent years. The most unequal country will be in our database, South Africa, will be between 65 and 70. Some countries in Latin America, I should say Mexico, sorry, Minister, it's not your fault, but it's around 60% in our database. Brazil, Chile are very high also. Let me say a few words about the fact that, so this is a world map of inequalities that we have put online last year at the World Inequality Database. This is not supposed to be, perfect data. We need to make a lot of progress, in particular in Africa, and I will talk a bit more about that, and the need to develop more cooperation with the tax administration in Africa in particular. But we've really tried our best to combine all available data sources, so household survey, of course, but also fiscal data, national accounts, in order to get comparable estimate across the world. Because the problem, as we know, is that if you only use household survey, you will tend to underestimate a lot the inequality, in particular at the top of the distribution. So if for some countries like the US or Europe, you have fiscal data, but for some other countries like Africa, you use only household survey, then the Gini coefficient and the level of inequality you will compare are in fact really not comparable. So what we do here is that we always correct household survey data on the basis of fiscal data. Now, of course, in Africa, we've made a lot of effort to develop cooperation to digitize some of the tax declaration and get income tax data, for instance, in Ivory Coast, and we have data from South Africa and a small number of African countries for which we have tax data. Now, for the countries for which we don't have tax data yet, what we did typically is to use some average corrections that we have for similar countries, which usually, it does not vary all that much, this correction across countries. So we feel it's better than doing nothing at all than to have this kind of correction. So at least we have a world map, which is not perfect, but which is more comparable than the typical survey-based Gini coefficients that we tend to use. And one of the substantial findings is that, well, Africa is very, very unequal. Now, Latin America is very unequal also, the Middle East, India, but probably maybe the even more important finding is the scale of the variation. So I told you for the top 10% share, basically it goes from 20 to 70% of total income. Now, if you look the next map, this is maybe even more important for all of us who are interested in poverty and development. This is the share going to the bottom 50%. Now, again, if we had complete equality, the share going to the bottom 50% should be 50%. And if we had complete inequality, it should be 0%. Now, of course, it's always between 0 and 50. But it varies quite a lot. In fact, it goes from basically from 5 to 25. So, in the most equal country, which will be again in Norway, Sweden, it will be around 25%, which means that, you have 50% of the population, they get 25% of income. So it means that their average income is on average half of the average income of the entire population. Of course, they are poor, they are the bottom 50%, but they are not that much below, the average of their country. Now, when you have 5%, so again, South Africa would have, a 6%, I think 6 or 7%. In Mexico or Brazil or Chile, we will be between 5 and 10%. If you have 5% and you are 50% of the population, well, it means that on average, you have, 1/10 of average income. That's not a lot. And the bottom line that I want you to remember in terms of orders of magnitude is really that distribution matters a lot, because when you go from 5 to 25% for the bottom 50% share, it's a factor from 1 to 5. So it means that for a given average income, for a given GDP per capita, the average income of the bottom 50% can actually vary from a factor of 1 to 5. So this shows, that if you only look at aggregate GDP, I mean, we all know that, of course, but you get it completely wrong about the living conditions, the material condition of half of the population. So we really need to pay more attention to this, and that's why we've tried to develop at the World Inequality Database this project about distribution, what we call distributional national accounts, where we try to distribute aggregate GDP and national income across percentile, combining national accounts with survey with fiscal data, so that then we can do some gross accounting exercise, but not only at the aggregate level, but for the bottom groups, top groups, etc. Now, let me come to the more historical part of my talk, which is that the other important finding is that this different levels of inequality and income shares going to the bottom 50%, top 10%, they are not frozen forever. You know, they change a lot over time for a given country. So if we take the case of Europe, you know, today you have 20-25% for the bottom 50 and you know, between 20 and 30% for the top 10, but it used to be very different. So if you go back in time, you know, 1 century ago, in fact, the top 10% share was over 50%, between 50 and 60% in most European countries, and the bottom 50% share was, you know, around 10%. So, you know, pretty low, you know, in the lowest country in the world. So how did we? Why did we have a rise of equality over time? So of course, you know, in recent decades, there's been a rise in inequality, but if you take at the very long run picture, you know, there's been a rise of equality, more equality in the long run. And, you know, this is good news. How did it happen? And this is where I would like to get now. You know, I think one of the key finding from our historical work is that, you know, probably the rise of what I describe here as the social state, you know, was a very important factor in the long run. You know, it brought more prosperity because investment in education, public infrastructure, health was very important also for aggregate prosperity, but it also brought at the same time more equality. So here you see that, you know, before World War I, you know, total tax revenue were pretty small in Europe. So here, this is an average for Germany, France, Britain, Sweden. There are variations across European countries, but you have by and large the same long-run pattern. Before World War I, tax revenue were less than 10% of GDP, and most of them were used to pay for the army, for the police, for, you know, the militaries that would finance also the colonial expansion, the colonial empire. You know, so it was really that kind of state. And social spending were very small. You know, 2% of national income for total social spending before World War I. Education out of that was less than 0.5% of national income. In the US at the time, it was about 1% of national income, which was twice as much as in Europe. And there was a big educational advance of the US over Europe. And, you know, in the middle of the 20th century, you still had this very big educational advance. But still, it was, you know, it was 1% of national income in 1910. So, you know, it was very small. Today, public educational investment for this same set of countries in Europe is 6% of national income. So it has been multiplied. You know, it has gone from 0.5% to 6%. It has been multiplied by more than 10. And this, together with the rise of health spending and other social spending, you know, contributed hugely, you know, both to prosperity and to equality. So that's probably factor number one. Now, factor number two is that in order to make this rise of taxation acceptable for societies, you know, you had to build trust in government in how you're going to spend this money, and also trust in government about the distribution of the tax burden. And so together with the rise of the social state and fiscal state in Europe, what we see in the 20th century is the rise of progressive taxation. So on this graph, you see the evolution of the top income tax rate over the course of the 20th century. So you can see it's a pretty chaotic history. You know, the bottom line is that in the middle of the 20th century, you had very, very high top income tax rate. You know, in particular in the United States, you know, it was, you know, 91% the top income tax rate under Roosevelt. It was still 70% in the 1970s before Reagan was elected in 1980. If you make the average between Roosevelt and Reagan, so between 1930 and 1980, it was 81% on average. And this was just the federal income tax. You also have state income tax, but they are much smaller. And apparently this did not destroy American capitalism, otherwise we would have noticed it. So, and in fact, if anything, I think it came with the highest level of productivity growth in the post-war period in particular than ever, you know, between 1950 and 1990. Productivity growth in the US was twice as large as what it has been since the 1980s. So, you know, the big decline in top tax rate was supposed to stimulate innovation, which of course from a theoretical perspective could have been possible, except that in practice, you know, the per capita national income growth rate was divided by 2. And I think, you know, the reason why this very high level of tax progressivity was successful is that because it was only for the very, very high income, which were not really useful from an incentive viewpoint, and it helped to build a social consensus about an overall increase of taxation and investment in education, the social spending that was very positive for growth. Now, this is for the taxation of income. You have the same for the taxation of inherited wealth. So here on this graph, you know, you have the evolution of the top inheritance tax rate. So you can see again the US, UK, and also Japan leading the movement toward progressive taxation in the middle of the 20th century, much more than Germany and France, which were sort of lagging behind. That's also because in Germany and France, you've had a big redistribution of wealth through, you know, inflation, war destruction. So in a way, progressive taxation was less necessary, and, you know, arguably progressive taxation is a more civilized way to redistribute wealth. But anyway, you know, that's how things go. Now, another historical graph on taxation that I want to show you is this one, which is about effective tax rate. Because sometimes, you know, when people look at this top marginal tax rate and statutory top tax rate, you know, people say, well, okay, but, you know, this was not relevant because nobody was taxed at this rate. Well, in fact, it's not quite true. So here, you know, what we've done is that we use the effective income tax paid by the different taxpayers. And we also, so on this graph, you have also all other tax. So we take into account indirect tax, payroll tax, social security tax. So this is the entire tax system in the US. And so you can see that, again, in the middle of the 20th century, you had a very high effective fiscal progressivity, in the sense that the effective tax rate paid by the, you know, top 1%, top 0.1% was substantially larger than, you know, what was paid by the bottom 50%. And I think, you know, this help first, you know, this help reduce inequality at the top of the distribution, which was very high at the time. And this also helped, you know, build the kind of social contract I was describing before, which is that, you know, at least, you know, people in the middle class or the lower middle class that were paying more tax as compared to previous historical period, they sort of knew that people at the top, you know, were paying even more than them. And I think it's a problem that we have today, which is today very often, you know, people in the middle class and lower middle class feel that the very rich are escaping taxation. From our series here, it looks as if today the system is not progressive anymore, and it's just close to a flat tax system if you take into account all tax revenue. In fact, it could be, maybe it's even worse than that. You know, it could be that we don't measure very well tax evasion, the use of tax havens by very rich, etc. So that in the end, at the very top, you can have effective tax rates that can indeed be below the middle class and even below the bottom groups, which can make people very angry about the, you know, the welfare state and about the world in general. And I think this is a big danger for all of us. Now, if we come to the lesson for Africa, for the rest of the world, you know, one point I want to make is that tax havens make it very difficult today to build an equitable tax system, not only in the US or Europe, but even more so. I mean, you can see on this graph that tax havens are even more damaging for Africa or Latin America. I mean, they are very beneficial, of course, for oligarchs in Russia and Gulf countries. But if you take, you know, the entire African continent or Latin America, the share of financial assets held in tax haven appears to be enormous. These estimates are probably lower bound estimates. They were computed by my friend and colleague Gabriel Zuckman. He did the best he could to use at the various inconsistencies in international financial statistics to come to this estimate. But, you know, in any case, the bottom line is that the sort of very opaque international financial system that has been developed largely by the richest country in the world, you know, partly to protect their own billionaire against taxation, in the end has been even more detrimental to countries in Africa, Latin America. You know, you can imagine how difficult it is for a tax administration in Africa to fight, you know, tax evasion, tax havens, and you know, already if European tax administration and US tax administration don't do it, already you can imagine how hard this is going to be for African tax administration. And another evolution that I want to mention is the fact that trade liberalization, you know, happened relatively fast, you know, since the 1980s, 1990s. Many African countries and lower-income countries lost quite a lot of tax revenue. In principle, you know, if this tax revenue had been replaced by other tax revenue coming from a modern income tax or from a wealth tax or a profit tax or whatever, you know, maybe these are better tax instruments than a trade tax, so maybe this would have been good news. But the problem, as you can see on this graph, you know, the big paradox of the 3 to 4 you know, past decades is that if you look at low-income countries, so here I'm looking, low-income countries are the bottom third income countries, so typically Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and high-income countries are the top third, so typically OECD. So you can see that in 1970, high-income countries already had higher tax revenue than low-income countries to begin with, and in fact, the gap has increased over time. So there's been no catch-up by low-income countries. So of course, it's a very complex process, you know, to build trust in the government so that you can build more fiscal capacity. And you know, I'm not saying that the decline in trade tax revenue was the only factor, but you know, I think this was one of the factors. And more generally, I think there was insufficient attention in the international community about, you know, helping build, you know, the tax capacity and in particular income tax, you know, as compared to what could have been done and what could be done today. So, you know, my own experience and our experience at the World Inequality Lab with trying to develop collaborations with African countries is that there's a lot of willingness in African countries, you know, to build this kind of cooperation, but very often there's too little support. So I was in Mali, in Bamako, in early 2020, and had very interesting discussion about representatives from the tax administration and from the Statistical Institute. And the problem is that they just didn't have the resources even to start to digitize the tax declaration from the income tax, from the corporate tax, where, you know, basically they have almost no data. They are getting, I have seen, you know, the paper tax declaration, they are sitting there, but they are not being digitized at all, which means that not only to measure inequality, but also to think about improving the tax system, it makes it extremely difficult. So they are being asked, you know, to fill Excel tables about, you know, development objective all the time, and which is certainly very useful. But you know, they you know, just basic resources to improve the digitalization of the tax declaration of their taxpayers, either individual taxpayer or firm corporate taxpayer, you know, is really missing. But you know, I think developing more you know, more collaboration in this direction is very important, because, you know, as we've seen from the example of rich countries, you know, the construction of trust in a tax system, in the social state, and the ability of a government to collect tax properly and spend the money properly, you know, has been absolutely central in the process of reduction of inequality in the past century. Let me conclude with this very last slide, which is about, you know, the inequality in carbon emission, which of course is one of the major issue we have to address in the future, and also one of the major injustices and sort of negative externalities produced by rich countries on you know, poor and developing countries. So this is work that we have done with Lucas Chancel, with co-directing with me the World Inequality Lab, and we keep updating this estimate. So what you see here is that, if you only look at total carbon emissions, you have sort of North America, Europe, China approximately at the same level, and then the rest of the world. But in fact, if you look at the inequality of individual carbon emissions, so if you look at emissions that are made by individuals who are in the top 1% of the world distribution of individual carbon emission, which corresponds to individuals who emit more than 9.1 global average. And this top 1% is quite important because overall they account for 14% of total emission, which is more than the share of the bottom 50% of the world. So if you take the bottom 50% of the world in terms of individual carbon emissions, they emit less than the top 1%. And you can see as this top 1%, well, basically is the US a lot, and Europe also a little bit, very little in China in terms of individual level of emission. And that's of course that's a very serious concern. And the question is, how long can we have free trade and free circulation of goods and services between countries that are contributing, these very, very negative externalities in some cases, and this raises a very, very serious issue for the future. And of course, that can also be one of the factors that make political change and ideological change happen at the world level, but for the time being, we have mostly the negative impact of that. Let me stop there. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Professor Piketty, thank you very much for a very, very enlightening presentation and a sharing of us. I think you've raised a number of issues which I'm sure are going to be informing the conversation further this afternoon. You've started off with a global picture to really paint what income inequality really looks like. Challenged our thinking by actually showing us that over the long term, we have seen a rise of equality. And as a result of that, you've begun to put forward some of the variables that have led to that rise in equality. So social spending becomes one of the talking points that you have raised for us. You've spoken about progressive taxation and the impact that has had. And of course, balancing that with a very candid understanding and approach of the impact of tax havens, and as well as other variables that have the impact of diluting the trust in the social system. And then, of course, you spoke a little bit about how we find the state of readiness of tax systems, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, the absence of digitization to really step up to the task of domestic resource mobilization. So all of these, I'm sure, are going to be plenty of issues that either Minister Guterres is going to respond to, or our global audience is going to take the time to respond to. What I would like to do at this moment for our audience is I'd like to introduce Minister Arturo Herrera Guterres, who we've said is the Minister of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico. During his professional career, he has served at the World Bank. He has served in private banking. He served the government of Mexico City, as well as the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. In the World Bank, we know that he led several efforts to improve public management in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And in private banking, he's been involved in a number of investment banking activities. We also know that he is an academic himself, having taught courses on microeconomics and macroeconomics, as well as monetary theory. So, Your Excellency Herrera Guterres, the floor is yours. We'll give you an opportunity to give us your presentation, after which I will expand the invitation and allow both Professor Piketty and yourself to respond to each other's presentations. For now, Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Your Excellency, we can hear you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity for sharing this panel with Thomas Piketty and exchange some ideas. He actually started not as you mentioned, also with a map of inequality in the world, but with a picture of his latest book in English. So let me start in a similar fashion with a picture of his book, but in the Mexican edition. I really enjoyed reading. But let me now move to his map. In the very first map that he presented, when he showed some levels of inequality in the world, Mexico appeared, as he's pointed out, in red color, as appear mostly all of Latin America, and that's not by chance. Latin America, despite being mostly a middle-income region, is the most unequal of all the regions in the world. In fact, Uruguay, which is the less unequal of all the Latin American countries, is most unequal than Turkey if you want to measure in terms of the euro expanded eurozone. So that's one of the main characteristics of inequality and in the region. And that despite the fact that the Latin American region has been growing relatively robust over the last 30-something years, particularly some countries like Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Now, unfortunately, that has not been the case in Mexico. Mexico has shared the first fact with Latin America of being a very unequal country, but does not share the other fact of Latin America of being growing relatively fast. In fact, the GDP per capita of Mexico since 1982 has been growing at less than 1%, GDP per capita at less than 1% since 1982. So those are typically the most relevant problems that Mexico faced over the last few decades: very unequal and very low growth. Now, it gives me an opportunity and as such, as you may imagine, this is part of what I typically discuss every day. But not always I have a chance to discuss it in a more historical perspective, which is what I would like to do. That since Thomas Piketty's book try to bring this historical perspective, the social perspective, and also issues related to ideology and what he called frontiers and property. And those are, as in many countries, long issues that has been hanging over the way in which policy has been developed in Mexico. I mean, since the colony first and all the way to the revolution, when the main assets, and if you want to talk about income distribution or more wealth distribution, the main asset was land. And it's not surprising that the Mexican Revolution in 1930, it has several aspects to which were motivating it. One was democracy, was ability to elect in free elections the president, but the main important was land redistribution, and in a rather complex way. It was not also about breaking big land owners, but also it was something that was important in terms of property. There was, from going back to the pre-colonial times, a very specific way in which land was owned, which was collective property, which was in the indigenous population it was kind of a common means of production, if you allow me to use that term, and it became a big issue at the beginning of 1910. So there was an agrarian reform, a land redistribution, plus laws that were enacted that protected collective property in what in Mexico was called el ejido, which was this property that was owned in the rural south. At the same time, there was starting large focus to try to increase, I would say, three different kinds of issues. One is what we will now call income distribution. The second one is social mobility. And the third one is to move people out of poverty. And those don't necessarily move in the same direction. People could be moving out of poverty, but if the income goes sufficiently high, you could end up with a worse income distribution. And there were several fronts in which this was worked during I would say, the first half of the 20th century. One, as I said, was what happened in land. The second one were very, very strong efforts to increase public education as a means to increase human capital, also health services. And starting in the late 1930s, early 1940s, was establishment of a social security system that would provide pensions, etc. Very interesting between the period of the 1920s and our 1940s was also a strong efforts and laws enacted to protect unionization, which as we know, is an important plays an important role when you talk about income distribution. After the 40s, unions were mostly captured, but by the state in one way or the other for a long part. And that's pretty much, I would say, the way in which the country was trying to evolve until 1980s, with one very specific issue. As I said, in the early 1920s, a big chunk of the conversation was about the countryside, but Mexico, as most countries, as it happened with capitalism, start to move towards a country that was mostly rural to a country that became mostly urban. Actually, the breaking point when rural and urban population crossed was 1967. And then we come to the very relevant break in 1980, which is a breaking of I would say the economic model and an ideological break. It's also the period of liberalization, etc. And as it has been documented elsewhere by many people, including Thomas Piketty and his team, you start having a move in the opposite direction of income distribution. Now, there's a particular aspects in which this is slightly different in Mexico and Latin America than in the rest of the world, because it's not only a move toward, I would say, more liberalization in the very traditional way and conservative policies, but it also coincides with a period of the debt crisis, an inflation period in Mexico, and the debt crisis leads to a fiscal finance crisis. Now, that actually exacerbates the problem of income distribution, because inflation, one of the consequences of inflation is that salaries, has been slightly more sticky than the rest of the prices, have a much more difficult to catch up. So one of the way in which regressive income phenomena happened was because the salaries were unable to keep their purchasing power in real terms. The second one is that as the debt crisis created a problem in fiscal finances, that became in part, in fact, a way to curb the growth in public expenditures. So expenditures in issues related to education, health, etc., which are not only ways to improve human capital, but ways to improve social mobility, were heavily constrained during this period. So that's why also we because we have a different story than many other countries, we think that macro stabilization and having stable public finance is not only a matter of large aggregates, of great aggregates of macros, but it's also a precursor to make sure that you could guarantee policies that are prone to have a better income distribution and social mobility. Now, a little bit later, we start with a program which has changed names over time. It was Progreso, Oportunidades, Solidaridad, which is one of the very first programs in conditional cash transfers. And to some extent, that kind of programs were relatively successful, probably not in the long run, in the sense that they wanted to move social mobility, but in the short run in terms of pulling people out of poverty. But as it was shown by Branko Milinovic and also by Tomas, that was probably focusing on the lower end part of the income distribution. So you could look to the elephant-shaped kind of graph that is mentioned by both of these authors in a very acute way in Mexico. Now, one additional issue which is extremely relevant in Mexico and may explain some of our challenges moving forward, but also some of the issues that were mentioned by Thomas, and it's related to our macro framework and our fiscal position. As you know, for the last 40 years or something, Mexico has been a very large oil producer. And one of the on the one hand, this is just manna coming out of the sky. But on the other hand, what that means is that we were able to finance until very recently large percentage of our budget out of oil resources, as opposed from taxation, which was a very important point that Thomas was mentioning. And I think this goes very much in sync to a view in which I would say the perspectives have been changing over the last few years. Because until very recently, probably over the last, until 10 years, the standard view was that you try to address issues on the social front and on the income distribution front on the expenditure side. You didn't address them from the income side. And the income was just a source to make sure that you were funding whatever you needed on the expenditure side. And now it is proved that the revenue side has two effects. On the one hand, it produces resources to have active policies, but on the other hand, it's also a mechanism to improve income distribution within a country. Now, the fact that we were a very important oil producer means that even now, we only collect less than 14% of GDP on taxes. So what makes us different than other countries is, yes, we have high income inequality like Latin Americas, but with low growth and with very low taxation rates and tax collection. Now that brings us to where we are. What kind of country do we have now? So one of your first charts in your book, but also in your presentation, which is a different way to measure inequalities, to focus on the percentage of the national income that is captured by the top 10%. And probably what you're trying to address with that is this elephant shape, because otherwise the Gini coefficient may not be moving on the same direction. You were showing results that were probably for some countries in the mid 55%. For Mexico, this is 59%. This is one of the highest concentrations in the top 10. In the top 10%. Now, what do we need to do now? Now let me make the problem slightly more broader, because this is one particular specific kind of inequality. When we address the issues of inequality in Mexico, we have to take a broader approach. And let me just give you 3 or 4 numbers. The GDP per capita in Mexico City, which as the country, Mexico City itself is an unequal society, is almost 7 times higher than the GDP per capita in Chiapas. The GDP per capita in the second wealthiest state, Nuevo León, is more than 4 times the GDP per capita of Oaxaca. And in the very old times, there was this hypothesis of the catch-up, in which lower income economies will eventually catch up with higher ones. We have actually a divergence in Mexico. So when we talk about inequality in Mexico, it's not only about inequalities of among social groups or classes, if you want to use an old term, but it's also about regions. And the second one that I want to mention, which is also one of the main differences with respect to our peers, is inequalities in between genders. Just give me one number there. Less than 50% of prime age women in Mexico are in the labor force. So there are cultural issues, etc., but it's very difficult to come that is sufficient to explain why we have a lower female participation than Colombia, than Peru, than Bolivia, than Ecuador, and than El Salvador, right? So these are issues. Now, what we need to do, and as well as Thomas, he because that's where his research is leading me, because I'm a public officer. Let me finish in a slightly more positive note. First of all, I would say these are issues that, for some reason, starting to converge the concerns about them, and the societies were very much in sync to trying to move in a different direction. Clearly, in Mexico, that was one of the cases, and that explains to a large extent why there was a change in the previous national election. Second, although there has been a prevailing increase of inequality across many countries, and people has been showcasing the cases in Western Europe and the US, which are much smaller inequality than the one we have in Latin America and Mexico. People understand that now it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and that it needs to be, and it's better for everybody if it's addressed. Let me just give you an example. We were able to pass a pension reform last fall, in which most of actually all of the increase in the contribution is going to come from the private sector, and it's going to increase the assets under management of the pension fund from 17% to 40%. And this was basically because some of the leading voices in the private sector at the firm levels were understood that it was impossible to keep having a country with this sense of disparities. And my sense is that that's where we were before COVID hits the world and hits everybody, including Mexico. And COVID is a tragedy, and it has effects on many fronts. One is in inequality and poverty itself. As many countries, when we imposed a lockdown last year, that displays a very large number of firms, particularly small firms, and workers, and particularly those workers that are unable to work from home. And that's typically people who have jobs on the lower end of the income distribution. I wouldn't be surprised if when the next national survey comes, poverty has increased substantially, and inequality has increased substantially. But COVID has also brought to the surface some issues that were somehow underneath of the national discussion. One obvious is, for example, do we have the health services, public health services that we need? And clearly, as most countries, we have to scale up our health services during COVID. But if we want to make that permanent, that will require us to finance it. And that will require us to reconsider, among other things, where is the money and what's the relevant tax structure associated with it. But also has brought something different, which is this sense of collective responsibility that is needed to address COVID. And that is opening an opportunity to discuss many of these issues. These issues that there are many issues relevant, like a pandemic, that requires the action of everybody involved in a society. It's important, and the fact that you protect others when you protect yourself with many ways, including using a mask, is creating an environment in which many of these issues is possible developing a window to discuss it. So with that note, I'll stop, and with the hope that we will be able, in the post-COVID economy, be able to construct a better world and a more inclusive and more just. Thank you.
Minister Gutierrez, that was an incredible contribution in terms of a keynote. I won't call it a comeback, because we're not in the ring. We are about sharing ideas, and I'm mindful of time. So I do want to just maybe acknowledge the usefulness of you giving us a historical lens, speaking to some of the levers from a policy perspective that the government used in order to try and address inequalities as much as possible, but also bringing us to the current frame, talking about the broader approach that Mexico is taking on to understand and measure inequality, and of course, including gender inequality, which is something that hasn't been scaled across the world. And of course, landing on the point of the impact of COVID-19 and how that has had an impact of increasing inequality and increasing poverty. Of course, not leaving out the positive side of that to say we have come to a point where we are finally having a sense of collective responsibility about how we engage and respond. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to open the floor and I'm going to allow each of you, and I'm going to ask for a lot of discipline because I'm going to give you 2 minutes each just to respond to what you have heard. So Thomas, I'm going to give you a chance first. I'm going to ask you, having listened to Minister Gutierrez, in 2 minutes, what are some of the key things that you would like to react to?
Well, first, I've learned a lot, and I would like to ask more questions to Arturo. It's in particular, I'm wondering why, according to you, is Mexico such a low female participation rate, and what should be done, what could be done, and how did it happen, and I get, there are many other questions, but you mentioned the fact that oil revenues sort of prevented in a way, or did not help historically Mexico to build more tax capacity, and I'm wondering, when did it start being really a key factor, or is the lag in tax capacity building, did it start earlier than oil revenues really became? Because Mexico, in a way, for all of us, is a puzzle that there was this very ambitious attempt, as you mentioned already 1 century ago, to have this ambitious land reform policy and then building the beginning of a social security system, and it did not quite deliver, including within Latin America, some countries like Argentina, which of course have a very different history, somehow managed to build more inclusiveness in some limited manner, and yeah, I don't know. I would like to continue the discussion forever with you, but the specific difference on female participation that you mentioned, I'd be happy to learn more about this.
Thomas, I think it's a fantastic question and very smart of you not to react, but to ask a question. So Minister Gutierrez, over to you. How do you respond to this question of the representation of women and how income inequality has played itself out across that gender lens? Minister, if I can ask you to unmute, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So that's exactly the question that we ask ourselves, because this was a problem that was easier to spot, that understand as causes and the solutions. And because at the beginning we thought it was a cultural issue, right? Latin America, a macho region. But then that didn't explain why we have lower participation rates than Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil, right? And it seems that we have a series of causes that are compounding each other. Let me just mention 2 that we're working on, because once you identify the reason, then you have to move towards try to addressing it. One is the lack of a national system of care. So when you have small kids in a country, or when you have elderly people in families, and as countries are growing, are progressing, lifespan is also is improving, and that's usually it's a good thing. But it's becoming by default that women are the ones who are caring for them. So the one thing that we are doing now is trying to understand how to create a national system, how much it will cost, and how it will and how do we share the finance. We think that eventually will pay by themselves. Let me just give you a number. If we have the participation rate of a country like Argentina, that will include 2 or 3 more million people of women into the labor force. That probably will pay for the system. The second one, which is something that we have to work really, really strong on, that is that particularly in large metropolitan areas, where there's an issue of very large commutes from the outskirts to the job, insecurity plays a role. If somebody has to commute 2 hours in and 2 hours out, that's a lot of time to feel unsafe during the day. And the third one is issues related to, that was a surprise, by the way, for us. We didn't have it in the radar. And the third one is about flexibility. More jobs require to have flexibility for females, because usually, again, they are the default if they have to take care at some issues at home. Now, the digital economy is opening an opportunity right there. But the fact there's an opportunity doesn't mean that there's a solution. What we are finding is that we have to train them to be able to do that. And we actually finished a program over the last few months of how to retrain women to insert themselves in the digital economy, and we expect to scale it up soon. I'll probably stop there.
Minister Gutierrez, I think it's a fantastic answer. The care economy keeps coming up in these conversations around inequality, and it's really interesting to see how your government is looking at this economy. Insecurity across transport infrastructure is real for women around the world, and that's an interesting insight that you've lifted there. And of course, the opportunity for flexibility as we're looking at new ways of working coming to the surface. Now, Minister, I don't know whether you're going to be as cheeky as Mr. Piketty and ask a question yourself, or are you going to take the opportunity to react? You've got 2 minutes. That's what I'm going to give you. It's totally up to you.
No, I mean, there are two obvious things that are relevant, and one is, and let me start where I finished in my answer, when you have the issues related to the digital economy. The digital economy is raising two very obvious challenges in the world. One is becoming a larger and larger share of the GDP. So it's growing faster than other sectors. But on the other hand, is much more difficult to tax. For example, in the very old days, when when all the intellectuals were in Mexico City and they were reading the New York Times or Le Monde, they basically have to buy it in a special store here, and they have to pay taxes here. Now, if they want to read those two papers, they subscribe online and they pay taxes in the US or in France. And this, in fact, has been the much more contentious problem among, I would say, or discussion among G20 countries, where there was basically an agreement by 19 out of the 20 to reach this idea of having a basic world tax on that. And there was one holdout, which was the US in the previous administration. Janet Yellen just mentioned that they are willing to move along. And that's probably in terms of both taxation, which was the issue raised by Thomas, in terms of global inequality, extremely important. I wonder how optimistic does he feel that this will be able to land to land properly.
Okay, I see what you've done there. So you've not only responded to the question, but you've asked a question as well. Thomas, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I mean, Minister, you know, as I give the baton over to Thomas for one last time, I must say you hit one of the central questions that had come from our global audience. And so, Thomas, maybe you can react to this as well. And the question was about how do we ensure that there is more effective taxation of the digital economy, but more importantly, what is your expectation of OECD countries and their plan in this regard? What could they do better when it comes to this particular issue? So you've got 30 seconds. I'll be lenient and make a minute, Thomas, but that's the final contribution.
Okay, well, I am more optimistic than, you know, under Trump, but you know, I am less optimistic than if we had a different European governance system. I think the fact that we still are under unanimity rule for tax decision in Europe, you know, it's a big limitation to the role that Europe could play in moving toward a more equitable tax system globally. Because in the end, at the end of the day, Europe is unable to make decisions. You know, we complain all the time about, you know, Trump, and we will complain about Biden as well. But the truth is that we are not playing, our role, because each individual country can put a veto, and so we actually never take a decision about corporate taxation. Look, maybe some things will happen at OECD, but in any case, it will be much less than what could happen if we had majority rule decision making and tax issues, which more parliamentary deliberation and decision. And I've been, as you mentioned at the beginning, I've been one of the author of this manifesto for the democratization of Europe, which proposes to put tax issues in the competence of a European Assembly, using national parliament members, and not only the current European Parliament, because tax issues are really the domain of national parliaments. So anyway, there would be a lot more to say, but as long as Europe is not fully on board on these issues, I'm afraid there will be limited progress in international cooperation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Thomas. So unless Europe is on board, and of course that speaks to the theme that the minister did raise earlier on, saying in Mexico there's a sense of collective responsibility. And what I'm hearing you saying, Thomas, is maybe that is what's missing from the global conversation, is that sense of collective responsibility and collective ownership. I'm going to give the minister the final word on this, because as we talk about the OECD and the gap that we are highlighting in terms of them really stepping up to leadership in this particular space, we know that Mexico sits within that grouping. So maybe, Minister, a final word from you before we wrap up this piece.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would probably say that as we start moving out of the pandemic, we cannot make of this kind of an impasse, a large impasse, and going back to the world that we have in 2019. We should take this very painful opportunity to build it better, and that includes addressing issues of income inequality, gender, trade, which we didn't talk about it, and of course climate change. Those were issues that were extremely relevant before COVID hit the world. They are even more relevant now, but we should take the opportunity that we are addressing this major issue together to try to build upon and to solve those other issues.
Minister Guterres, thank you very much. Now, I want to close off this conversation by doing this. The minister corrected me when I started speaking and said, Thomas did not start speaking about the global map. He did start with his book. So let's just make sure, Minister, that you and I are square, because we also have a book here in Johannesburg, South Africa, and hopefully we're getting a digital signature in the airwaves on the back of that. It's a massive thank you to Professor Thomas Piketty, as well as His Excellency Minister Arturo Herrera Guterres, for an absolutely insightful conversation. It has felt like a masterclass in global inequality, and of course with a special case study on Mexico. Thank you very much both for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Now, as we pick up on the conversation, I'm going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to please stand by and don't go away, because the conversation continues. I've made you a promise that at the back of the interaction between Thomas Piketty as well as Minister Guterres, that we are going to be expanding this conversation into a panel discussion. But as we head into our panel discussion, take a moment to please enjoy this following video. It is a video that really captures the spirit of one of the reasons that we are here for, which is, of course, the launch of the second phase of the research facility. This video is going to speak to some of the future research areas. It's going to speak, of course, to the continued partnership and collaboration with research centers, with other donors, and of course with governments and local authorities in particular. On the back of the video, we're going to go into a panel discussion. So hang 10 and I'll see you on the other side.
In 2017, the European Commission and the AFD started working hand in hand on the reduction of inequality through the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities. Funded by the European Commission and conducted by the AFD, this initiative funded 23 research projects in over 20 countries. After the publication of 100 research papers and policy briefs, the facility allowed to deepen the knowledge and understanding of economic and social inequalities, their determinants and underlying mechanisms. These findings also supported the formulation of recommendations to find the most effective policies and approaches to reduce them, in a joint reflection with EU member states. After 3 years of research, what's next? The success of this initiative called for an extension of the EU AFD research facility on inequalities from 2021 to 2026, with a global budget of €3 million. This new phase is articulated around 2 objectives. Firstly, to support partner countries in the formulation of policies to reduce and address inequalities in the context of the implementation of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Secondly, to render the policy-making process more inequality-sensitive, inclusive and effective. This time, the facility is going to focus on 4 partner countries: South Africa, Mexico, Colombia and Indonesia. How will it unfold? The objective is first of all to target, through prior research work and by using the diagnostic tools and methodologies developed in the first phase, 1 or more priority intervention themes. For each theme, a relevant public policy will be identified and analysed, with particular attention to the interlinkages between climate change and inequalities. A set of recommendations related to the previously identified topics will then be issued in each of the countries in accordance to their potential to reduce inequalities. Tools and methodologies will also be developed in order to inform policy decision makers on the impacts of public policies on inequalities. The policy supported in the framework of the extension will therefore be the result of research developed in collaboration with local research institutions, following a broad consultation with stakeholders, governments and local civil society organisations. These policies will also be supported by expertise and technical assistance to ensure their sustainable impact. It is our goal, our will, and the long-term success of this programme that all this knowledge will then enable partner countries and development actors to better understand the dynamics of inequalities and to better respond to them in terms of public policies. Follow our updates and join us for this new initiative.
I certainly hope that you're going to be responding to the invitation to join us on this second phase of the facility. As we move on now, I'm keeping my promise of expanding the conversation into a broader discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce my panelists. I'm going to start off by introducing Luca Chancel. He is the co-director of World Inequality. He joins us in this panel. We're also joined by Martin Seychelles. He is the Deputy General Director in the Directorate General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. You will see on your screen Ms. Emilia Garcia. She is the CEO of TECO Mexico, as well as a member of FIA. She's a young activist, and so very importantly today, infuses the voice of young people into the conversation. You will also help me welcome Tomás Melonio. He is the Director of Innovation, Research and Knowledge at that particular division at the AFD. Welcome, Tomás. And of course, we welcome back Minister Gutierrez, who has stayed with us in the conversation. Let me start off with yourself, Luca. When we think about the World Inequality Database, what does it tell us about the barriers to the political economy barriers in fighting inequality?
Well, I think, and first of all, thanks for the invitation. Good afternoon to everybody. I think that, one of the biggest barrier today is that governments and policy actors are not looking enough at the information at hand, at the data at hand, in the sense that we continue to think in many countries as if we hadn't had 4 decades of attempts to, bring tax rates down and to deregulate the economy. Now that we've done this experience live in many countries, and that we've realized that this didn't necessarily lead to higher growth rates for the bottom of the distribution or for the middle income groups in many countries, and that it didn't lead to higher employment rates for the vast majority of the population, then perhaps we can start to try to discuss about alternative policy options. And these alternative policy options may include different ways to look at taxes, so more progressive taxes, different ways to look at how we intervene as government, how governments intervene in the economy. And we still continue to base, or a lot of governments continue to base their thinking about economics without enough information about the distributional impacts of their policies. That is the inequality impacts of the policies. So we need more data, and now that we starting to have this data, we need more governments and policymakers that actually use this data. That's a big barrier today.
Fantastic, Luca. That's such a strong start to say that not only do we need more data, but we need to start using the data. And as you've said, you're calling for alternative lenses in terms of the use of policy. And maybe what I would love to do is maybe just quickly circle back to Minister Gutierrez on the back of that response, Luca. Minister, as you ended off your interaction with Thomas Piketty, you did end us off by talking a little bit about the impact of COVID and beginning to look at the current situation and the future. The question I'd like to bring to you now is, what are Mexico's actions to ensure a sustainable and an inclusive recovery? Because this is the big conversation now. How do we recover? To use your own words, Minister, you said we need to build back better. So how do we ensure that we do it in Mexico in a way that is both inclusive, but is also sustainable? If I can ask you to unmute, Minister.
I think I'm on mute now, right? Yes. I have a double control, one here and one by my people around, and they are very, very tricky. No, I think, let me first go back to one of the issues that Luca just mentioned, which is like, if over the last four decades, things have not been particularly working, we should try something different. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, he mentioned exactly what it is. And that's one of the things that we did. And on the fiscal side, we did two things. One was to realize that we could collect a little bit more taxes without necessarily, at least at the first try, to increase taxation. And that was basically by closing some of the gaps that were helping tax evasion. And we have a very large surprise in 2020. We have the largest decrease in GDP since 1932, and we were extremely surprised that we increased marginally tax collection. So that means that the tax evasion that was around was so large that even with the largest hit, we were. The second one is, what do you do with those taxes? What do you do with those revenues? And the common view was that the budget is incremental, that is really inertial, that there's very little that you could do, that the budget is committed. But the president, he put us a very, very complicated task. He decided to really redo the budget. And that's a painful situation, because you make large cuts in programs that you don't believe that they are working, but somebody was receiving those programs, and you channel back those programs. So let me mention two things that we think are really important and are slightly related to the labor force. One is in terms of we see that a large problem of income, of social mobility and income distribution, was that the income distribution of the income of the young is very much correlated with the income of the parents. And one of the things that was happening is that as soon as they were reaching certain age, let's say 16, 17, even slightly older, even if they were in school and they were doing well, they abandoned the school because they had to help their house. So what we created was a very, very large scholarship program. And the scholarship program plays two roles for people in that way. Not only provides a support, but it also put a number to the opportunity cost. Because if they go back to support their family, they may be earning less than what the scholarship is providing. So that may help them to stay there. And that's one of the things that we want to double down for the recovery. The other one is in the labor force. There was an increase of the use of outsourcing to an extent that now currently for 25% of all the formal labors all the formal jobs in the economy are through an outsourcing company. So that means that they have less social security, health services, pension, etc. So we're changing the laws with the help also of the private sector to ensure that if there's a legitimate way why people need to outsource, that's okay. But if not, we have to do it. So it's about taking care and making sure that we have better jobs from now and into the future.
Minister Gutierrez, it's a fantastic response to an issue that Luca has raised, which is, are we making data-driven decisions? Are we looking at policy from a data-driven perspective and allowing the data to guide us in terms of where to direct that policy? And you have given us a few examples of how Mexico has changed direction, having looked at the data and the impact of its own policies. But maybe let me come to you, Emilia, because we know that in order for that change in direction to take place, oftentimes it requires engagement. It requires engagement with government so that there is a change in direction in terms of how we are addressing inequality. So the question to you is, as an activist, what are the best practices that you have observed in terms of engaging governments in the reduction of inequality? What works?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. What we've seen is it is very important to have data-driven decisions, as it was previously discussed, but this information has to be accessible for everyone. And authorities, I'd like to make 2 points. We need to identify which are the authorities that come into place when a decision is taken. So there's a myriad of options there. And then authorities have to understand that it implies a shift in power. They have to acknowledge that. And that implies uncomfortable conversations and really taking a multidimensional approach, having a representative participation from people, an actual opportunity of co-designing these programs and decisions. Because as far as we've seen, best practices have not been seen when authorities only ask people or do maybe an exercise of consultation. It implies a lot more than that. We need people to really have a space to change and adjust and co-design these types of programs. So we do have, we're looking for this balance for technical, academical, data-driven process, and then the political part of it, and then of course the civil society's participation. Because if we look at history, we've seen a lot of evidence where civil society has been the one to push these changes, and for instance, it is difficult for people to find the spaces. I would like to put on the table a special example for Mexico and slum inhabitants. The minister was previously talking about property and how we're talking about more than 70% of people, and more than 70% of people in poverty live in urban areas. So slum inhabitants, not only in Mexico but worldwide, are a special example of inequality of people that have been trying to really push for that space for them to be heard. And Mexico is in the way to become one of the first countries in the world to have official information about how many people live in the slums and where they're located. And that was a people's power achievement. And just to be clear, like people's power achievement, there's no political party that owns it. We're talking about really grassroots level pushing, and this was thanks to slum inhabitants organizing and really coming to the judicial power in this case to present a situation where data was not being collected by the official authorities. And we've seen that where the authorities have this space for listening, then the policies that come after that will really take into consideration and have the success factor that we're all looking for this shift in power.
Emilia, I think, your point resonates strongly with one of the insights that came out of our opening plenary, which was this idea of also putting the lens of inequality of voice as one of the ways in which we should be thinking about inequality. And as you speak about broadening the decision-making pool, making sure that we're co-creating and co-designing policies in a more inclusive way. You talk about really bringing in civil society into the conversation, and then unleashing the people's power as we talk about looking at inequality. It feels like we're coming full circle in terms of the conversations we started off with in the opening plenary. So thank you for that contribution. Allow me then to go to Thomas Melonio. Thomas, we've been having a really great conversation about understanding the barriers that exist within the political economy, but what about the tools? So if we think about an organization like the AFD, what are the tools that organizations like yourself could be using to overcome these political economy barriers as you pursue inequality reduction?
Thank you so much, Nozi. First, I'd like to say that AFD, as a development bank, is demand-driven. So we only work with countries that have the determination to fight inequality. Some do, and we have seen that Mexico is amongst them. But some actually do not ask us to work with them on inequality, so we don't. So first, I'd like to specify that we have tools, but only with countries that actually are committed to fighting inequality. I'd like to describe an example of something we've done in Morocco. So we will leave Mexico for just a few seconds, but for the benefit of the audience. In Morocco, we together with the government, we worked on fiscal incidents and the progressive effects not only of taxes, but also of social spending. It was said earlier on by Thomas Piketty and Minister Herrera Gutierrez, but of course the redistributive effect can come from social spending. And we have found that typically in Morocco, amongst the poorest 10%, 39% of the revenues come from social spending, and in particular education, which is particularly well targeted. So, of course, when we think about the fight against inequality, we think about taxes. It has been discussed earlier on, but also well-targeting expenses is very and extremely important. We have seen a video about the next phase of this research facility, and typically we plan to work with 4 governments, so Mexico again, Colombia, South Africa, and Indonesia, in particular to accompany efforts to measure how spendings can help reduce inequality. But again, the tools we design are only there and useful when governments ask us to work with them. When we do loans, for example, we have a country that takes the risk of borrowing to fight inequality. It's a big risk, so I'd like to acknowledge the effort of such governments. And again, this research undertaking that we're having with many local researchers can only take place when there is sufficient political commitment. And there are many people theorizing trickle-down economics, but we have seen that it's a bit more complicated, and that we certainly need to measure precisely how social spending can reduce inequality. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. There is that we need to go beyond theorizing about trickle-down economics and really track whether the intended funds are reaching the grassroots, as Emilia had indicated and identified. I mean, you speak about demand-driven organization, and it's, of course, this speaks to the importance of political will. And back to this core issue that Minister Gutierrez raised, which was, are we highlighting and prioritizing inequality as the one big thing that we need to get right as part of building back better? So maybe an opportunity now to bring in development cooperation as an angle. Mr. Seychelles, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. And we've been talking about policies. So the question to you is, what policies do you think development cooperation actors should promote in partner countries if we really are to overcome the political economy barriers that stand in the way of inequality reduction?
Well, thank you. I mean, I'd like, first of all, to put this in the context of what Minister Guterres was just saying about the impact of COVID. And there's been a lot of discussion, of course, of how COVID is exacerbating inequalities. But one aspect which maybe is not talked about sufficiently is, as Minister Guterres mentioned, this is also now the time when we need to talk about building back better. And it's also a time to seriously question some of the assumptions we've been making over the years. This is not just a question of returning to whatever we're doing in January 2020. I'll just mention a few quick examples. Of course, the world depends a lot on financial markets, for example, and it's true that more developed financial markets may theoretically enable more individuals to borrow, but there are countless studies that demonstrate that financial development is more likely to benefit those who are already well off because they have easier access, of course, and privileged access often to finance. Similarly, for financial globalization, this can also affect income inequality because the movement of capital across borders, such as through FDI, generally tends to go from advanced economies to relatively high-skilled sectors in emerging and developing economies, again, exacerbating the inequalities. Not enough attention has been paid also to high levels of unemployment or precarious employment in many cases, even in Europe. This is a problem. And we know this, again, contributes to inequalities because it reduces the bargaining power of workers. And last but not least, another issue I put on the table is we need to question also how we're going to handle technological advancement. Of course, this is not a problem per se, but it is also an important factor to consider because it favors those, of course, who have higher skills. It may increase the skills gap, and it reduces potentially the demand for lower skill activities. So definitely we need evidence, but we also need to look at ways in which we can strengthen our commitment towards redistribution. As Breen said, we need more investments. We know from our European experience, for example, that investments in health and education are among the strongest means of redistribution, the most effective means of redistribution. This will then in turn raise the issue of how you mobilize domestic resources, because these require considerable investment and sustainable investment over a prolonged period of time to yield results. And increasing domestic resources on its own is not sufficient because this will not be politically supported by the population if there isn't a clear demonstration of efficiency and fairness. So results have to be also very visible. And it also means we need to provide countries around the world with a greater capacity to tackle things like illicit financial flows, fight tax evasion, etc. So one challenge we have and which we need to work on is that in many countries around the world, there is a high proportion of informal economy. And this obviously makes it very difficult to actually raise tax revenue. This has been exposed very brutally, I would say, by the COVID crisis. And work is needed there to also increase the productivity of the informal sector, but also facilitate the transition to the formal economy. The final point I would emphasize, but really, really important for us, certainly in the European Commission, is the multidimensional nature of inequalities. And we need to mainstream. Inequalities is not a standalone topic. It needs to be mainstreamed in everything we do. A lot of causes of inequalities are sometimes unintended effects of policies in other areas that are well-meaning, but where the inequalities have not been assessed sufficiently robustly and in depth. And we have countless examples. I won't go into those, but I think we are all aware of those. But this is indeed an opportunity to change that. So basically to analyze in anything we do in this recovery phase, the impact and the potential effect, positive or negative, on inequalities.
Mr. Seychelles, it's a fantastic answer as you raise a number of the issues, of course, that also help us to circle back to some of the conversations in the opening plenary. What comes to mind right now is the reality that we've been speaking about Latin America and Africa, and very frankly about, to some extent, the inability to endogenously recover without the support and the assistance of development cooperation partners, especially in the context of inequality. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have less than 10 minutes, so I'm going to try something really special. I want to try a final round of questions with absolute discipline to really quick fire responses from all of you. And I want to start where I ended. Mr. Seychelles, I want to start with you because I want to close the loop on this question of political commitment. We've heard Mr. Melonio speaking about it. And the question to you is, where there has been demonstrated political commitment, what is the most effective way of supporting that political commitment so that we can really see the impact that allows us to move just beyond commitment to actual action on the ground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some of the questions from our audience as I go through this final round as well. But Mr. Seychelles, to you first. How do we go beyond political commitment to political action?
Well, commitment needs to be supported. It needs to be sustained. And the best way to support that, of course, first of all, is through the mobilization of necessary resources, transferring also of best practices. There is no need, certainly, to reinvent the wheel every time, but also through evidence. Simply put, no government can afford to make mistakes in this area. So the evidence has to be as clear as possible and has to facilitate decision-making as much as possible. And here I'd like to pay tribute to the work of the research facility, because this is the moment where we actually need the best possible evidence base. And indeed, if anything, the complex decision of these multidimensional problems will require more and more and better evidence. So I would really say to support policymakers in this endeavor is first and foremost.
Support policymakers with better evidence and, of course, better data. Luca, I'm coming to you next. And there's a question from our global audience that I'd like to bring to you. You suggested, Luca, in your opening response that we need to almost reimagine policy. We need to be open to alternative policies. So I think you might like this question. And the question is, do we not think that it is about time that we started to think about degrowth rather than always seeking economic growth? Today's economic growth seems to benefit the richest population and therefore seems to increase inequality. Is it time we look at degrowth? What is your response to that, Luca?
Well, my simple answer would be that we need some degrowth in certain sectors of the economy for sure. For instance, the oil industry, for instance, a lot of pollution-based industries. And at the same time, we need growth in other sectors. We've talked about education, we've talked about health, and we need to talk about green sectors of the economy which need to grow. And then whatever is the impact of that on the overall rate of growth as we measure it today should be a second order question, provided that our social systems, our pension systems are decorrelated from the rate of growth of the economy. And the issue is that in the Western world, we've constructed our social protection systems in a way that they are actually following that they need a certain amount of growth. So we need to do this decorrelation in order to be able to engage in the energy transition, in order to engage into more education and health funding in a way that can be decorrelated from this notion of growth. But the good point here is that our basic indicators of progress, for instance, GDP, is not really well suited to monitor real progress, it's not suited at all to monitor the evolution of inequality, the evolution of well-being, the evolution of prosperity. So I would say that we definitely need societies that are post-growth, but whether this means overall degrowth or overall growth, this should be a secondary issue. What we really need to focus is on these concrete objectives, environment, health, education, for instance.
I love that. So let's not all think in big picture and broad brush stroke. Let's get into the detail. Let's look at individual sectors and let's have detailed, data-driven conversations around what we need to do there. Minister Guterres, I want to come back to you on the question of labor. In your earlier response, you gave us one of the examples around the phenomenon of outsourcing labor. So there's a question here that's coming from our audience, and it links to the digital economy, which you already spoke about in the first panel. But it says, of course, the digital economy appears to be difficult to tax, but what about regulating it? Is Mexico also looking at how to regulate labor standards in digital jobs? Are you looking at regulating labor standards in digital jobs? Your thoughts on that, Minister?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, it presents a new challenge, a new sector, but it's part of a broader problem. Mexico is a relatively well-off country. It's a high medium income country, but that label hides many of the inconsistencies behind it. And let me give you one of the most obvious. 50% of all the people in the labor market work in the informal market. So when we talk about the pension system, when we talk about improving minimum wage, when we talk about those issues, that only apply to the 43% that work on the formal labor. The digital economy is more likely than not gonna fail under certain circumstances in the informal labor. So what I think that we need to do now is to go slightly broader, try to see how could we improve either the work conditions on the informal labor, or how to start moving people in a meaningful way from the informal jobs to the formal jobs, and then probably put some specific effort to the digital economy. But that is just a part, which is it's a problem, but it is part of a much larger problem.
Thank you very much, Minister. Of course, raising there the importance of that process of formalization as we look at the opportunities of job creation, but also decent and qualitative jobs within the context of the digital economy. Emilia, one of the conversations that I'm sure you were listening into in the first panel discussion raised by Professor Thomas Piketty was, of course, the phenomenon of not having as much women representation in economic activity, not only something that is true in Mexico, certainly in my country, in South Africa, it is something that we're looking to improve, as I'm sure is the rest of the world. What are your thoughts in terms of how do we galvanize a larger portion of the women population to become active participants in the economy as one of the ways of reducing the barriers of inequality in the political economy?
Question, Nosy. I think women have been particularly active in the political movements lately, and one of their demands is for us to have that flexibility. Actually, the minister referred to it a couple of times, but I think what we need to do is to actually open up the spaces for leadership for women, and the spaces will be taken care of, because what we see in communities and grassroots levels, it is women that are leading their communities, which have that collective kind of way. And what we need to do is to take into consideration that we're looking for structural changes. So that means a change in incentives in short and medium and long term, but we do have to have a very clear way in which women in the short term will have that benefit, so that the change can be easier. But I think leadership is out there, and we've seen it in many countries, is the most important political movement that is taking that balance in every country to make the better decisions.
Fantastic, Emilia. Thomas, I'm going to end off with you on this panel discussion. I mean, one of the things you mentioned right up front in your first response was, you know, the fact that the AFD works with demand driven, works on a demand approach, and is demand driven in terms of how you engage. The question that I'd like to bring to you is that what would you like to see more of in terms of localized development banks and the extent to which they could partner with organizations like the AFD, so that your partnerships really help us move beyond, as you described, the theory of trickle-down economics to the real people on the ground? What could those partnerships look like?
Well, thank you, Nosy. Just a few comments. So one thing I said earlier is that certainly we need governments that are interested in inequality and measuring how spendings are targeted. And probably what I'd like to see is more governments interested in doing so. Like I said, we're happy to do more with more governments. Secondly, development banks. It's true, we currently, AFD chairs a coalition of development banks. So we're trying to discuss with other development banks so that they also measure the impact of their investments. So they are not only public spendings by governments, but also investments led by public development banks, such as Caisse des Dépôts in France, but we could name NAFIN, or we could name many banks, the DBSA in South Africa. So we're very interested in having a conversation with also such important financiers of public policies, because public policies are not only government policy, they can also be led or financed by development banks. So we're happy actually in having this conversation with more than 453 development banks within a coalition that we named the Finance in Common, so that all these banks are mobilized against inequality. And to be honest, also we work on climate change, and we hope to work on biodiversity with them. Because again, we've discussed governments quite a lot, but let's not forget that many public policies are also financed by other actors. Not to mention the fact that we'd like also more private financial institutions to join the coalition so that together we fight against inequality and climate change. So our door is open, and I'd be happy to have more contacts after this conference.
I think it's a fantastic way of closing off this invitation. It's a call to action to all other development banks, a call to action to private sector players, because indeed, Tomoya, you're right, that the financing of those policies that we believe are going to be the key drivers of reducing inequality are not only going to be financed through government spending. It has to be a shared and collective responsibility for all organizations, all sectors of our society. And so with that, I'd like to say a massive thank you to my panelists for leaning into the conversation, for sharing their thoughts and their insights, and really giving us the best conversation that could have flown from what started off as a fantastic debate between the minister and Thomas Piketty. Now, as we prepare to close, what I am going to do is I am going to give Thomas one last opportunity just to give us some closing thoughts as we close off this conversation, and then I'll see you straight after this. So Thomas, as a closing thought, what are the few words that you might have for our audience?
Well, actually, it's not a thought, it's just a thank you for our panelists, and to you, Nozipo, for chairing this conversation over the last 4 days. So it was a huge work, and we are very thankful that you managed to do that perfectly. I'd like to thank also the real organizers, not myself, but my AFD team, Enda, Felipe, and Delphine. Also colleagues at the European Commission, Martin, that we saw today, but also Henriette Geiger, Gabriela, Alessandro, and Françoise. And also our colleagues at ICID, the Spanish Cooperation Agency, in particular its chairman, Magdi Martinez-Soliman, and Javier Jimenez. So maybe a particular thank for Minister Arturo Herrera Gutierrez. It's always the most difficult job to be the representative of government. People are always looking at you with this particular expectation. So you took the risks. Thank you for taking it. On a more sad note, unfortunately, as I said, there were many research teams involved in the conference, 23 of them. Over the last year, we had 3 researchers and friends who passed away. So I'd like to have some thought for them: François Akabedia in Côte d'Ivoire, Samuel Fambo in Cameroon, and Crispin Muka in Zambia. So it's unfortunate. I'd like to acknowledge their memory and share some thoughts with them. Again, we are quite enthusiastic about the next steps. So it's been presented in the video. And again, I'd like to thank the European Commission for funding and supporting and chairing this effort. So Martin and all your team, I'd like to acknowledge your support. And again, I hope to hear from you very soon. We'll have additional webinars to discuss the ongoing studies, not only in Mexico, but also in Colombia, Morocco, South Africa, and many others. And we'll be happy to host you again. So without further delaying the conversation, I'd like to greet our panelists again, and thank you, Nozipo, for hosting and chairing us over this journey. Thank you.
It's a very big thank you to you, Mr. Molano, and your organization for making this conversation possible. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure journeying with you over the last 4 days. We certainly hope that you will continue to partner with us and to journey with us as we go into the second phase of the research facility. I look forward to seeing you in more conversations, more data-driven conversations as we heard today, and of course, more informed conversation as we also look to make sure that there is equality of voice in everything that we do from here on. From myself, Nozipo Shabalala, in the tip of the African continent, in Johannesburg, South Africa, it's goodbye for now.